It's the second quarter, and your team is up by a touchdown during a midseason game. Suddenly, time is called, and pandemonium ensues. A group of coaches and teammates gather on your sideline and surround something that you aren't able to see yet. You push your way through the crowd, catch a glimpse of one of your teammates, a senior, seizing up on the ground. The paramedics on site surround the player, doing several checks before rushing him to the emergency room. This was the real-life case of Scott Eveland from Illinois. This is not working. There we go. Who, after being taken to the hospital, was given emergency surgery to relieve pressure from internal bleeding. However, the damage had already been done, and Scott was confined to a wheelchair and forced to communicate through a keyboard, likely for the rest of his life. According to reports, several weeks before the accident occurred, Scott had likely suffered a concussion that had gone unchecked by coaches and staff at the school. He had complained of headaches and even had to miss several parts of practice because of the pain. And on the day of the incident, Scott had requested to sit out of the game for precautionary reasons. His concerns were ignored, and he was instructed to play anyways. After participating in the game for 2 quarters, Scott collapsed on the sideline. This was a completely preventable injury, and cases like this are all too common in high school and college athletics. As a matter of fact, Scott is just one of thousands of student athletes that are injured each year due to negligence from the school, coaches, or another source. While there is much debate on the issues of schools paying for negligent injuries, the fact of the matter is, while some injuries are unavoidable, most can be prevented. According to the Weinstein legal team, we know for certain that in any given year, high school athletes alone will account for approximately 2 million individual injuries, as well as 500,000 doctor visits and 30,000 individual hospitalizations. In fact, of all the sport-related injuries treated in hospitals, we know that children aged 5 to 14 account for nearly 40% of them. We know that schools can be, but are often not, held liable for injuries caused by negligence. And we must also remember that athletes who are injured often feel pressured to continue playing and end up worsening the injury. So what is meant by a negligent injury and an unpreventable injury? Well, an unpreventable injury would be something to the effect of a sprained ankle or torn ACL. These are injuries that can be suffered simply by playing, and the coaches, field conditions, and equipment is not at fault. However, a negligent injury is an injury suffered at the fault of the equipment or a coach. Examples of negligent injuries could be a concussion suffered in football because of a faulty helmet, or a base not being anchored correctly leading to a sprained ankle, as well as other similar scenarios. I present to you the following scenario as an example of a negligent coach injury. A baseball player reports to the coach that is feeling discomfort in his throwing arm. His coach dismisses it and puts him back into the game. That player continues to play, and after making a throw, completely tears a ligament in his shoulder, ending his year and requiring Tommy John surgery. This type of negligence applies to every sport. So at this point, you might be asking, why does this matter? Should athletes not be made to pay for their own injuries? Do they not understand the risk? And of course this is true. I personally have participated in athletics for the majority of my life. From baseball to swimming and boxing, I know the risks that come with competing against another person, and choose to accept those risks anytime I compete. Myself, as well as every other athlete who participates in a sport, willingly put our bodies on the line to accomplish a goal. However, I, as well as all of the other high school and college athletes, pay the school money to ensure that the equipment that we use will do its job and that the athletic trainers and coaches will keep us safe. So yes, these are all valid questions. However, we must remember what an important part of life that these athletes are in. Some may be preparing to go to college or even get a scholarship to play in college. And to have that taken away because of negligence is an injustice. Not to mention the fact that medical bills for injuries suffered on the field or court can be anywhere from $200 to $30,000 on average, which is a massive burden for any individual or family to bear, as well as the severe psychological impact that not being able to participate has on student athletes. Now, all of this in mind, what can be done? While most who argue for this issue simply say, the schools will resolve it, or I'm sure the issue will resolve itself in time, they do not address the specific issues at hand. One of the most important things that schools can do is ensure that the playing surface is safe. This would involve checking fields for any holes or divots, as well as lessening the use of turf and other artificial materials, which have been shown to cause 16% more leg injuries than traditional real grass. Another solution can simply be making sure that the equipment being used is up to date and not damaged or defect in any way. Money made from concessions and ticket sales for games could be reinvested into the team, allowing them to provide better equipment for players and potentially reduce the amount of negligent injuries. And of course, while these changes will take time, it is worth it to ensure that students are staying safe as well as encouraging other students to take part in team sports. Another one of the more pressing issues when it comes to the safety of student athletes is the presence of faulty equipment. Athletes rely heavily on their equipment to keep them safe, especially in heavy contact sports such as football, rugby, and hockey. It is essential to keep all equipment up to date, as according to the law attorneys at Darrigo and Diaz, defective helmets and joint pads can lead to significant injuries, as these products are heavily relied upon by athletes in many different types of sports. If an athlete is wearing a defective helmet, it could lead to serious injuries such as a TBI, traumatic brain injury, neck injuries, and possibly even death. My interview for this presentation was Coach Kenneth Cray, a former professional baseball player who played Division I baseball at the University of Florida in Troy and for the Canton Crocodiles at the independent level. When Coach Cray was asked if schools should invest more money into equipment and field upkeep, he responded, "I feel that any sport that makes money from athletes, which all programs do, from Little League up to the major leagues, has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the field is safe and playable, that the equipment being used will protect the kids who wear them. I believe having the threat of potential liability for injuries caused by negligence will make programs invest some of their profits into protecting players that are ultimately making them money." Examples of faulty equipment causing injury can be found within every sport, and it is essential that schools keep all equipment up to date and in good condition, as injuries suffered from these faults are most commonly seen in the form of broken wrists, elbows, and knees, as well as brain injuries, which can have potential lifelong implications. Injuries like these often do require surgery, and at times do not permit an athlete to play again. Another issue, one that often goes unnoticed, is the issue of injured players feeling pressured to stay in the game. Team Edge Athletics has found that more than 53% of coaches said that they feel pressure from parents or players to put an injured athlete back into the game, which can lead to the athlete furthering the injury. And of course, this was seen earlier in the example of Scott Eveland, who had voiced his concern before suffering the injury. An important step in the right direction would be to ensure that coaches are properly trained on how to handle a situation with an injured athlete. There are ways to minimize situations where this is an issue, with schools doing regular quality checks on equipment that they issue, as well as making sure that the playing surface is safe and adequate in order to minimize injuries of this sort. Which brings us to our next issue, the turf field. The turf field is a relatively new concept, as it first saw usage in the mid to late 1960s. The material itself is most often made of nylon or plastic, with a base made of rubber pellets or sand. The product itself was marketed as a more cost-effective and safer alternative to real grass. However, as we are going to see, that is not the case. While I will concede that the turf field does provide an aesthetic advantage, as well as being useful in a practice or indoor simulation environment, this does not make up for the spike in athlete injuries that occur when these fields are used during games. Perhaps the most famous case of this was Aaron Rodgers, who suffered a season-ending injury while playing on a turf field against the Bills in Buffalo. The NFLPA, or the National Football League Players Association, is the labor union that represents the National Football League players and is made up of members who are elected by the players themselves. Shortly after the injury suffered by Aaron Rodgers, the association called for the removal of all turf fields from NFL stadiums, stating that artificial turf is significantly harder on the body than grass. Based on NFL injury data collected from 2012 to 2018, not only was the contact injury rate for lower extremities higher during practices and games held on artificial turf, NFL players consistently experienced a much higher rate of non-contact lower extremity injuries on turf compared to natural surfaces. In the same article, former Green Bay Packers center J.C. Treader stated that, "Whenever I practiced on an artificial surface, my joints felt noticeably stiffer the next day. The unforgiving nature of artificial turf compounds the grind on the body that we bear from already playing a heavy contact sport." The writers at ESPN found that there are a higher rate of foot and ankle injuries on artificial turf compared with natural grass on both new and old generation turf, and that elite-level football athletes were more predisposed to knee injuries on synthetic turf. Despite these facts, there are currently many high schools across the country that are attempting to make the move to turf fields. A crucial aspect of this is that while professional athletes are struggling with turf fields, high school athletes who do not have nearly as much experience or access to the same training and recovery programs are also playing on this surface. When asked about the increase in injuries on turf fields, Coach Cray said, "That is not very surprising to me. As a former college and professional baseball player, I've played on both artificial turf and natural surfaces. I felt there was no give on artificial surfaces as your cleats would dig in and stop immediately, whereas on natural surfaces or grass, the clay would provide some give." The conditions that he is describing is a very common side effect of turf fields. That is just one factor causing the spike in athlete injuries when a turf field is used. The high schools attempting to make the switch from natural grass to synthetic turf argue that the move is a wise decision as it reduces upkeep costs and overall looks better. The writers at Keystone Sports Construction, a company that sells turf fields, argue that opening up the possibilities for your athletic department translates into healthier students, exciting event possibilities, and revenue opportunities that quickly justify the switch to artificial turf. The writers then go on to argue that it is a wise decision, as a wise investment, as well as an improvement regarding the safety for athletes. And thus, those in favor of turf fields believe that the fields themselves are more cost-effective, as they require less maintenance to keep, and overall last longer than real grass. The article goes on to argue for enhanced safety, claiming that the artificial surface prevents the buildup of mud and water. It is for these reasons that many advocates for turf field believe that they are an improvement over traditional grass. However, these statistics are often provided by the producer and distributor of the fields who have financial invested interest in promoting their product. I completely understand the position that many people take on this issue. As stated earlier, the turf fields are useful for practice facilities and simulation environments. However, the arguments for turf fields are categorically false. For starters, while many claim that the artificial field is more cost-effective, a turf football field will cost a school, on average, around $750,000 to $1.25 million just to get it installed, as an astronomical number for any high school to have to pay. Additionally, as far as safety goes, while turf fields do counteract mud buildup to prevent slipping, the material that the turf is made of is notorious for being extremely slippery, even in dry conditions. Research found that 16% more injuries per play on artificial turf occurred compared to natural grass. The authors concluded that if all games had been played on natural grass during that period, there would have been 319 fewer foot and leg injuries. Looking only at the non-contact injuries, the risk was even higher, about 20% more per play. So draw your own conclusions about artificial turf, but regardless, the evidence is there and natural fields are safer and more cost-effective overall. Am I saying that turf fields won't ever be as safe as natural grass? Absolutely not. However, I believe that waiting for the technology to catch up and provide a surface that is actually safer would be the wisest decision. So what role do the schools play in all this? As stated before, there are more than 2 million injuries suffered by high school athletes every year. It is for this reason that every athlete must accept a degree of risk before stepping on the field. However, according to the U.S. Center for Disease Control, more than half of all sports injuries in children are preventable. That is a shocking statistic, to be sure. So if these injuries are preventable, who is liable to pay for them? The NCAA offers its insurance policy to athletes, as well as many other school-sponsored recovery programs. Despite this, there is no program currently available to college athletes to fully cover the cost of a lost scholarship. On top of this, no such program exists for high school athletes at all. While oftentimes a high school can be held liable for negligent injuries, that is more than often not the case. Additionally, the further implications of these injuries must not be overlooked. Take the case of Deja Thomas, an SMU women's basketball player, for example. Thomas had an award-winning high school basketball career and joined the SMU women's team in 2015, where she continued to be a top player. However, when Thomas suffered a knee injury, instead of being given an MRI and rehabilitation protocols, she was given steroids and fluid drains so that she could continue playing. By the end of the season, her knee had completely broken down, leading to the loss of her scholarship. This is just one of the examples of an athlete suffering an injury and bearing a financial burden far beyond just medical bills, as the cost of tuition at SMU is around $61,000 to $80,000 per year. And losing a scholarship can often lead high school students to attend a different college, which also has life-changing implications. This topic was discussed during my interview with Coach Cray. And when asked if students should be entitled to payouts for negligent injuries, he responded, "This is a tough question, but my answer would be yes. I feel every athlete who plays a sport understands the risk. Injuries happen. However, as a former athlete, I put a lot of trust in the field that I'm playing on and the equipment that I'm using. Why should he not, when he and other athletes rely on team-issued equipment to keep them safe?" The other side of this argument is that the parents of these athletes have access to insurance payouts. Therefore, paying for injuries should not be an issue. This is shown in the fact that 34% of public and private high schools have no access to athletic trainers in the United States, as they deem it unnecessary because of this fact. Not to mention, there are multiple health insurance companies that do not cover injuries suffered while participating in athletics. Additionally, these rules are not set in stone, and the parameters of what is covered vary from agency to agency. All of this to say, high schools need to implement an insurance policy similar to the NCAA's, available to student athletes because of these potential financial implications. As 1 Peter 4:10 says, "Each one has received a gift. Use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. That is all these athletes wish to do, as they attempt to glorify God in their respective sports using the gifts that they have been given. If we're being real, this is probably not the most impactful speech that you've heard today. You've heard my peers speak on issues such as addiction, human trafficking, and the decline of critical thinking. But regardless, this is not an issue to be taken lightly. And if you're nothing else that I say here today, just remember that schools all the way up from middle school to college need to prioritize student-athlete safety above all else. And as we continue to either participate in athletics or cheer on our athletes from the sidelines, do not forget the steps that need to be taken in order to prevent negligent injuries. From deciding between turf and natural grass, ensuring that injured students are cared for, as well as keeping safety equipment up to date. To the coaches, you are the most important person to these athletes when they are competing. Continue to do your best to take care of injured players. To the schools, consult students about what they need and ensure that they have the proper equipment to keep them safe. If we follow these steps, I'm extremely confident that we can make big strides towards safer athletics programs. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Bryson. Sorry? So his question was, are there any organizations that are working to ensure that student athletes aren't being hurt as much? Was that your question? Okay, so in my research, I actually did research that a little bit. There aren't many. There are a few programs that are available for athletes who lost a scholarship, basically just support groups. But other than that, I couldn't find much. So I would say nothing substantial would be my answer. Yes. So the question was, what made me want to cover this topic? Well, I actually read about the case of Scott Eveland and Deja Thomas long before I decided that I wanted to do this topic, and it made me interested, which is why I included them in the speech, and basically just researching that and finding out all that information made me want to do that. Any other questions? All right, cool.